We will have Erik Wilde, one of the the third co-author of the book. Yeah, Erik, how are you? Erik,
I'm
can you
doing
hear me?
well. Hey, yes, I hope you can you see me?
Yeah, we can see
I
you.
can hear
It's
you and I can
stabilizing.
see you, but it seems like you cannot hear or see me.
I think there's just some lag because of
Okay,
the AWS outage. So I will just let you share your screen and do your presentation.
okay, okay, yes. And if anything goes wrong, thank you, Mehdi. Please let me know by talking because I cannot see my screen. I'm in California right now, so I come to you from far away, and I only have one screen, which right now shows the slides, so that's all I see. Okay, so welcome everybody. Hello, I'm Erik, one of the authors of Continuous API Management. If you're interested in the slides, I just posted a link on my Twitter profile to give you an online version of the slides in case you want to look them up or follow along. And with that, let me dive right in. A little bit maybe about my background, where I come from, what I do right now. So I've shared the same experience as all the other authors, right? So we were in the API Academy together. This is when we wrote the first edition of the book. We did a lot of traveling. We did a lot of presenting at conferences. We observed a lot of trends. There were a lot of things we saw developing. We saw people getting challenged by. And it was something where I always think it's like that really was a very important experience. And I continued in a similar role, but since now we have been 2 years of pretty much not traveling anymore, I've been doing another thing, which is I spend quite a bit of time on creating videos. So if you want to check out some API videos, and I actually just recently did one with all the authors, you can find the link here. So once again, if you want to check out the slides, you can just go to the online link on Twitter, and then you can just click here and play the video. So what I do nowadays is I have a similar role in Xway, which is another API management vendor, so to speak. So I continue working in that space, and I see a lot of things that are happening in that space. So one of the things that was special, I think, about the continuous API management book in my mind always was that we were very specifically saying, look, it's not just about single APIs, it's about the landscape. And so we very purposefully split the book into individual API issues and landscape level issues, because most organizations, they have a lot of APIs and they want to manage not just one API, but their whole portfolio of APIs. And we see that this is becoming more and more important because, as a friend of mine recently said, right, APIs are popping up like mushrooms. You have a lot of them. And the question then becomes, what do I do with these mushrooms? How do I make my mushroom landscape most effective and get the most out of it? And the point there to me really is, and here's just another link to one of the videos that I did. APIs, in my mind, APIs are many things, right? But the APIs that are really valuable are, in my mind, languages. There are ways how different teams in an organization talk to each other. Right? Where one team says, look, we're doing something here. Let's say we do some analysis of customer data, and you can find certain trends about customers. Let's say what they're most likely to buy or whatever it is that you do. And then they build a service for that, an API for that. And that API then allows another team to use that capability, right? And build, for example, an application that works better for that customer because now they can tap into whatever analysis was being done on customer data. And in that case, what really happens is it's a language going on, right? A language that in one team allows that team to use the capabilities that were developed by a different team. And the more easy you can make this, right, the better this language works, the more these APIs that you build within your organization and externally, the more those APIs will be used. And in the end, that's the most important thing. Like Mike already said that, or also that in the end, it's not just about having APIs, it's about getting APIs to be used. Because if it's not used, it's pointless, right? It needs to be used. And when you look at this general idea that an API is a language that allows two teams to communicate, right? So one team designs the API, the other team discovers, understands, and consumes the API. And the more easy I can make that for both teams, and the better the API is described and made consumable, the more they will use those APIs, and the more I get out of my investments into the API landscape. Now, what this quickly gets you to is then trying to better understand, how do I design the best languages? Because if what matters is making people talk to each other in order to innovate, in order to build new solutions, all these kind of things, then one of the really important goals I have is to make sure that these languages, these APIs, are the best possible languages that I can make. Now, 3.5 years ago, when we started writing the book, I think we were in a different position than we are today. We were in a position where it was clear that, let's say, SOAP isn't great. Everybody agreed on that, so to speak. Everybody was using RESTful APIs. GraphQL was already on the rise. People talked about it, but it was still kind of a niche. And the whole event-driven space hadn't taken off yet. So we were more in a space where we said, it's good to have many APIs, and you should think about your landscape and so forth. But it was more that you would think, yeah, probably most APIs you'll design nowadays will end up being RESTful. And that's different today. And because of that, what we decided to do is we decided to add a new chapter to the book, talking a little bit more diversity, about diversity in the API design space. And in particular, diversity in terms of the language style. How do you approach this design task of turning an API into one that works well for the problem that you're trying to solve with that API? And the point there is, and I think we make that point quite often throughout the book, for pretty much any problem out there, there is no best solution. And I'm really trying hard for a couple of years now never to say best practices and best this or that. A solution is always a solution in a given context. And I think the same can be said for an API style. And the example that I'm using here is cars, right? There is no best car. Depending on your context and who you are and what your needs are, different cars have different quality attributes that you will weigh differently depending on your preferences and needs, right? So you might want a car that has history to it and that you just like on an emotional level. So you might get kind of an old timer car. And then you will notice that all I'm showing is German cars. That's because I'm German, but you could do the same with other cars. But we have the same here, right? So you have maybe you really need something that can you can drive it anywhere. So you might get like a really capable all-terrain car. You might want a lot of space, but kind of travel still in a very luxurious way. So you might get like a fancy SUV, or you might be all about like speed and that idea that you really want to feel like a race car driver. So you might just get a sports car. And all of these, of course, are good cars, right? But none of these is the best car. They're all good cars. And we took this idea and thought about what it means for the API context. And when you just look at some of the typical tasks that happen in the API design space, right? There is design context, and there is no design without context. Design always takes into account a certain context where you say, okay, these are the constraints that I design with and for, because otherwise you just can't design. And typical scenarios that you might see is there's something like these backend for front end things where you pretty much just design an API for an application, in which case kind of it's a very tightly coupled idea of how do I design the best API to drive this application. That's a very special use case. You might have a little less closed use cases with APIs actually meant for general consumption. But even there, you might have big groups of different API designs that make sense for you, such as you have private APIs that are mostly intended to be used inside an organization. You may have partner APIs that are intended to be used by partners, not just inside your organization, or you may have public APIs that are intended to be used by anybody. And these are different design constraints. You might choose to use different designs because, for example, if you design something for internal consumption, you can make very different assumptions around terminology that people are used to, the whole conceptual model that the API is based upon. Maybe also you want to make sure that it's better a part of this whole landscape of existing APIs, right? Where, for example, to give you a counter example, right? If you look at a public API, you might just design it as an API that is kind of used out of context, just like a user going there and figuring out how can I use this API as quickly as possible, right? And then you have to make it really easy to consume. And that's kind of a very different task potentially. So what this all comes down to is that design context is different nowadays because you have more and more APIs, and we also see that variety has been going up. And therefore, what we decided to do, and I'll just walk you quickly through that to give you kind of a little sneak peek of that part of the second edition of the book, is we added a chapter on styles, because we've seen that the variety and the styles part of APIs has increased. So GraphQL has still gained popularity. Event-driven APIs are much more popular now. And again, it's not the fact that you would say, well, now, newsflash, event-based APIs are the best APIs you can create. Right? That's not true, I would say. What you would say is, hey, it's nice that we have a new design option that we can build on. We can build event-driven APIs. And for some problems, for some design tasks, this is a good solution. So I might start using those APIs. And for others, I might still use REST, or I might choose GraphQL. And the point here is that as somebody in charge of not just a single API, but of a whole API landscape, managing that diversity, and that's one of the pillars that we have in our landscape model, right? Managing the diversity is important so that you don't get too many different ways of how APIs are being built, but that you still might say, okay, but we're building 2 or 3 different types of APIs because we see that there are very different problems that can be solved with those API styles and certain technologies. So we're fine with not just saying everything has to be REST, or everything has to be GraphQL, or everything has to be event-driven. Right? You're kind of really able of managing that design space and saying we have a couple of design points that we use, and then for each problem that we have, we assign it kind of that design point and say, okay, this problem actually is a RESTful design is a good fit for this problem. This problem and event-driven design is a good fit for this problem. Right? And the better you become at that, the better you are able to build good APIs, but you still control the diversity. So you have some governance, right? What Ronnie was saying in the beginning, you have some governance, but the governance is not overly restrictive. And in order to really understand that space well, what we've added is we've added this chapter on API styles, and I will quickly walk you through the styles. These are the styles that we've identified that are the ones that are kind of governing, so to speak, or fly above the actual API technologies. So these are general styles of APIs, not specific technologies. I'll get to some technologies in the end. And it is a good idea to really familiarize yourself with these styles so that you understand where they come from, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and then you have a better idea of deciding which ones do we use, for which design should we maybe make this choice or that choice. Let's jump right in. So the first style that we identified is what we call the tunnel style. So the tunnel style is kind of the good old RPC model. Right? It's this idea that your API is kind of just a program where you can call functions or procedures, whatever you call these things. Right? It's a very programming-oriented model where you take what you have in terms of code and just ask yourself, how can I expose this code so that it can be accessed from the outside by an API consumer? And then what you end up with is kind of a distributed programming idea, right? It has been around for a very long time. I think since the 70s, I think, was the first time that this whole idea of remote procedure call came up, which said, wouldn't it be nice if I could call a procedure remotely, not just locally, but remotely, right? Because then I could write a program that spans multiple computers. And that works, right? It's an approach how you can make an API landscape work, where if you have a program, it calls like a function or whatever you call that thing on a different computer, and you can make it work. That's fine. And there are a whole bunch of technologies around this, right? So in the API space, probably the most well-known ones that we know of, more in the past, SOAP. More currently being popular is gRPC, Google's RPC model, right? But it's really mostly a programming mindset around this. So this one works pretty well when it's mostly about how do I build APIs that are consumable by developers directly and want to build like a distributed system. But it's probably not such a great approach for building business APIs. And like anything that I say today, right? This, you could argue about this, but that's my claim here. Okay, let's move on. The next style we identify is resource style. And the resource style is the one that we see being used a lot for APIs for quite a while, and still, where the resources are these URI identified things, the resources that live somewhere that you can access, you can interact with them, oftentimes through HTTP. They have certain access methods, and they are backed by implementations, of course, but you don't know about the implementation, right? So here, what we have, instead of having these functions being directly exposed, we have resources which are abstractions, such as there's a customer, there's a product, there's an order, there's an invoice, right? So all these are resources which make much more sense if they are designed well on the business level. And the implementation then, of course, has to somehow make those work. But the resources are something that is more of a concept that can actually align with business level concepts. So when you look at these things, right, it already is quite a departure from the tunnel-oriented style, which is much more implementation focused. And the resource-oriented style, right, it really makes a major step towards a more problem-oriented service design, because you design these spaces of resources that are available, you define interactions with those, and it's something where you can make things easy to use. But one of the problems we see here, and this is something that I think particularly Mike and myself, right, we have been yelling about for many years, is that if you only do this, what this lacks in comparison to the web, which is the most successful information system humanity has ever built, what this lacks is navigational context, right? So it's not that easy in just a resource-oriented design, for example, to say, how do I find from a customer resource which orders are pending for this customer, right? You can, of course, make this information available, but there's nothing really baked into this fundamental style that helps you doing that. And there is a style that allows you to do that, which is the hypermedia style. So the hypermedia style is still resource-oriented, but it's also based on the idea that you interlink the resources. So it's pretty much what you know from the web, right? Where you expect that if you go to some page on the web, you can't just look at that page, but the page will also tell you, and here are 5 other places where you can go, where you find related information, where you can do related things, or you can initiate some task or whatever it is that you want to do. So in that case, what you end up with is it's a much more task-oriented view of the resources, which not just allows you to interact with resources, but to also have interactions across resources by providing you with links. So these hypermedia APIs then are another style, right? Because what you have is you mix the resource representation with links, so that's useful. And these links allow you to walk through basically one API, but even also across APIs, which is pretty cool, right? So you could say, well, here's a resource like a product, and if you purchase that resource, here's actually a link to a payment API where you could pay for that. And then once you've paid for it, you can come back and I'll actually allow you to ship it. So So there are these interesting workflows that you can now better support through Hypermedia APIs. So for workflow-oriented APIs, oftentimes Hypermedia is actually a pretty good style because it supports the idea of a flow across resources and not just here's a bunch of resources, good luck figuring out how to orchestrate all of them. So that's great, but it can sometimes be a little bit tricky because the tooling maybe is not quite as mature as it is for the resource-oriented style. So again, right, it's always a kind of a trade-off. Next up, the query style. So the query style is quite different. The query style, GraphQL comes to mind, right? The query style has this idea of saying everybody wants different views into potentially complex data sources. So let's build kind of a query model right into the API idea. So in GraphQL, right, so you have the GraphQL query language basically and the GraphQL data model. And that's what GraphQL gives you. It allows you to build data model, and then it gives you this query language that then returns the results of the query to you. So in the end, what you have with a query model is just a way of creating structured data. And that can be very useful and powerful, but it also is something where oftentimes it creates a pretty tight coupling between like different sources of data that need to be integrated into kind of this graph that you can then query. And people have all kinds of different views, right? So some people say, well, we should build APIs so that the whole enterprise is just one giant GraphQL graph. And maybe that's fine. Seems to be hard to pull off from what I see, but it's one approach you could take. But it seems to be something that at least for some applications, like the prototypical one, right, would be Facebook, who built GraphQL, building their app to query into kind of the social graph, right? So for that example, maybe that's really good design to work because you have this pretty tight coupling between that graph and the app that is also controlled by Facebook. So there's no issues around keeping those two in sync. And it's something that clearly works in some cases, but it can be hard to pull off if you want to have like more isolated APIs that can be used like in a more loosely coupled ways. Like here's a payment API, here's a messaging API, here's this API, here's that API, right? So if you're really into this idea of building blocks, my query APIs don't quite fit the bill, but in some other scenarios, they're good. Okay, let's move on to the final style that we've identified, which is the event-based style. So this one really has gained in popularity in the last couple of years. And it's quite interesting because it reverses kind of the control idea, right? So typically our idea of APIs is that there's a consumer of an API and they send a request and they get a response and then maybe that repeats, but that's the general process. For event-based APIs, the control flow is reversed, meaning that when there's an event happening, the consumer of an API gets alerted, so to speak, of that event happening, or they subscribe to those events, different lingo sometimes, but generally speaking, right? It's not that as a consumer of an API, you, for example, always have to ask, did a new order come in? Did a new order come in? Did a new order come in? But instead, you have an event-based API that if a new order comes in, it will just send to all the subscribers of that event the information that, hey, here's a new order, right? Who's picking it up, right? Who's dealing with it? And that, for some scenarios, can be really useful. So this reversing control idea is really interesting because, as I said initially, APIs are languages. And languages also have this reversal of, or these different variations of control, right? Where sometimes a good interaction is if I can ask you something. And other times, a good interaction is if I just sit there and when something happens, you notify me and say, hey, something happened. You should maybe do something about it. Right? And event-based APIs give us this reversed idea of how communication can get initiated. And that can be very useful, which in my mind is why this style is so successful, because it's the first style that gave us like this reversed idea of a control flow, which clearly is a good match for some scenarios. So therefore, this might be a good thing to have in your general arsenal of API styles that you use. The issue with event-based in my mind always is that it does take quite a bit of more work to make this happen, right? So oftentimes you hear about Kafka or similar things where there is quite a chunky bit of infrastructure somewhere there in the middle, which is something that we try to avoid with other API designs. So that's something to keep in mind of, right? That you now suddenly you have this big piece of infrastructure in the middle again, which needs to work. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, if you're willing to take that compromise, then it may be a good thing to do. Okay, now to conclude, what does this all leave us with? In my mind, the most important thing to really understand is there is no style hammer. There is no best API style. There are good API styles that have different strengths and weaknesses given the problems you're trying to solve. It's probably a good idea to have an API landscape that uses not just one style. It's not really like we always solve every problem like this, right? But really to say, look, there are different problems, and here are, let's say, the 2 or 3 typical ways of how we try to find a good solution for a problem. And if you're open for this, then I think you have a much better chance of building these languages, these APIs, that are well designed and are useful solutions to the problems you're trying to solve. If you manage those styles, you're also more likely to have a landscape that has some coherence where you say, okay, we're not just using REST, but we're just using those 2 or 3 styles, right? So you have some coherence where you say, okay, it's not just one thing, but it's like we govern this idea. And we give API designers basically these choices, and they can choose which one seems to work best for their problem. And I think this is the better solution than what I call style fundamentalism, right? Where you would just walk around and say REST all the time, or event-driven all the time, or GraphQL all the time, right? So that might just paint you into a corner that at some point just produces solutions which are not good solutions to the problems they're trying to solve. So be mindful of those styles that exist, that they have different constraints, different strengths and weaknesses, and maybe manage them in a way that you can have more than one in your organization. And overall, right, in organizations, what you will find is there's a whole bunch of technologies. I won't even go into this, just to show you, right? All these styles have a lot of technologies in the real world where they are being used. Here's the list. The list itself, of course, is much longer, just some examples here. So don't just pick a technology and say we always use the technology. Be aware that if you pick a technology, you kind of also pick a style, and then understand what that style is good for and not so good for. Okay, and with that, I am done. Thank you very much. Once again, if you're interested in the slides, you can find them in my Twitter feed. I just tweeted the link. If you want to find out more information about myself, you can find me on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Please subscribe to my videos. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mehdi.
Yeah, Erik, thank you very much. We will keep the questions for the panel moment. But you say that there is no preferred style.
Sounds
People
good.
call REST, GraphQL. Then there is no need of API conferences if we don't have fanatics like that, right? So don't feel.
We should have just fights. You know, it should be more like a sporting event, like people actually jostle.
And actually, just for the story, tomorrow we have a clash debate, REST versus GraphQL with Arnaud Lorey and Jonathan Jazulo, who is the founder of the GraphQL meetup, inside the conference in the GraphQL track. So we have 1 hour on REST versus GraphQL debate, just because we're an API conference, right? Thank you, Erik.